Let's go ahead and start. It's really my pleasure today that we have Gary Smaby visiting. Gary and I had the privilege of working very closely with Gary when we built the residence. Much of the art you see in the residence is Gary's artwork, and what you wouldn't know is that almost all of the art and where it's in the residence is because of Gary's effort at figuring out how to distribute all of the art pieces within the building. And at a time when we were, of course, overwhelmed with doing so many things, it was great to have such a wonderful partner in that effort. So we sort of have an eternal thanks to Gary for all he's done for the Institute. But most importantly, he really wants to tell us about how he approaches his artwork and what he probably has in store for what he's thinking of next. So to no longer embarrass you, Gary, take it over.
Fantastic. Well, it's a delight to be back. I must tell you, when I first arrived in 2012, not really knowing what to expect, I was familiar with the outside of the building, and I was familiar. I had actually spent a year across the street at the Nanotechnology Institute, and a couple years before that I was in residence at UCSD, but I'd actually never been in the building. And it turned out one of the major buildings in Minneapolis, which was my main home, was built by the same architect that designed this building. So I had this vision when I was going to arrive that it would be covered with high-tech flat panel monitors. And so when I arrived, unlike some of the other residencies I've done at other places, the first day I was invited to meet with David Gross, who was the director at the time, and Lars, and immediately given a coffee cup with my name on it, a key to an office, which I'd never had before, that arrived at least before my residency was done, and invitations to dinner. And then the last invitation I got was an invitation. I was just kind of in a strange place at the time. I think I'm a stranger in a strange land, and he invites me then to give a Blackboard talk on Monday. And I thought, and I of course said yes. What else am I going to say? I had no idea what a Blackboard talk was, and I was walking down the hall outside of the office, and it dawned on me as I looked around that all I saw were slate boards around. And I'm a visual artist, but not with chalk. And so I think it was, over a weekend that I had to think about it, and I thought, well, how am I going to do this? And so I decided I would do a talk about why I'm not a physicist and do it digitally using digital chalk. So I designed it with computer graphics to simulate that I was using chalk. And then, I began to think, okay, I'm going to be here 6 weeks. How's this going to work? I don't have, the science background. I have a science background, but not college-level science background. So, again, I knew that I would be like a fish out of water. You all know that this place is renowned in the world for your field of discipline. What you don't know is that in the field of arts and letters, those of us who are in that world, this is, I've described as a naked singularity, a physics term I borrowed from somebody. And when I first arrived, we were just talking about this. There was a playwright in residence here. There was a senior executive TV producer here from Nova, who had been with Nova for 28 years. There was a journalist in residence from Scientific American, and all three of us felt like fish out of water. At least the person who was the journalist from Scientific American could actually make out maybe the first panel of equations in a given morning during the lecture, but the rest of us, by the time it filled at the end, we were kind of glassy-eyed. And I thought, well, okay, I got to figure this out. What can I do here? And so, with David's permission, and it needed David's permission, I said, I'm going to shoot black and white portraits, and I'm going to do it unobtrusively from the back of the room. I had digital camera so I could turn the shutter off, long lenses, and I said, hopefully no one will even know that I'm taking pictures. And you'll wonder, well, why I did that, and I'll show you what came out of that. And at the end, you know, most of the people that were here at the time didn't know that I was photographing. And you've all met David, and David basically said to him, if any of you have trouble with Gary taking pictures of you, you just let me know. And I don't think anybody ever walked in and said, David, I got a problem that this guy is taking pictures. So I had pretty much free reign. And I called the exhibit, the portfolio that I put together, At Work, At Play, because that's really what I felt from you. And you'll see how I ended up coming up with this particular model of photography. So if I flash back, this was 2012. If I flash back, and you'll undoubtedly recognize some of these individuals. That one you won't recognize. Well, you recognize, but it doesn't look like that person looks like today. So I started my career doing this kind of photography, shooting rock and roll artists for record companies. And I thought, well, it worked back in 1974. It should work in 2012, which it did. And it was just a lot of fun for me. And I described it to people. They said, well, how do you go in and shoot pictures of people that you can't understand? You don't really know what they're talking about. And I said, well, I viewed it as if I was viewing a performance. And each lecture that I heard was a performance. And you'd be surprised what nonverbal communication occurs when that's all you understand. And as a photographer, observation is what I do and capture things. And at the end of, a session, usually at the beginning of the session, the fellow from Scientific American would give me a hint. He'd say, okay, this is what this particular lecture is going to be about generally. And if you want to know a little more, I'll point you to the article that I wrote in Scientific American that was about this particular presenter. That helped a lot from knowing nothing. But, and at the end, when I capture an image, and you might remember the one on the blackboard there of the woman kind of looking up, I knew that something had occurred. I wasn't quite sure what it was. And so I asked one of the physicists who I got to know, and I said, okay, so what did I see here? What emotion did I capture? And he said, and this might not be exactly right, but just paraphrasing what he said, well, she was presenting a rather controversial theory. And as I recall, there were 7 authors on that paper, 3 of whom were in the audience.
Oh, wow.
and one of them took issue with something that she was presenting. I couldn't even tell you what the topic was. But the look on her face tells me, oh no, I think I missed on this one. And she made it through, but I quickly realized whatever pressure I would feel in front of a group, the pressure that you all feel when you're presenting in front of sometimes Nobel laureates or authors of papers that you have been involved in, you're under a lot more pressure than I am, because your career is dependent upon how well you perform. I can just be dismissed as the artist in residence, because I don't need to have the exact answers. So when Lars said you were going to have a music room in the residence, and he knew that I had done this in the past, he said, well, how about you put together a series of images from that point in time? And I said, great, I'm happy to do it. So a lot of these artists you may recognize. Those of you who are from this country who probably know it better than those of you who aren't. But for those who don't, I know that Lars sometimes has a contest. And when people are taking tours through there, he'll ask, because there aren't any names on the photographs there, they'll ask how many of you can identify all the pictures that are in that room. And occasionally you've had what, maybe 2 or 3 people who've picked them all out?
Very few. It's
Very
the upper
few.
Left, the upper left was the one nobody knows.
Yeah, so, yeah, Edgar Winter's probably a tough one. Mick Jagger is probably pretty easy. Joni Mitchell is probably pretty easy. That was a very young Carlos Santana, Neil Young, David Crosby, who recently passed away. But almost all of the people that I was shooting back in that period that are still alive and still performing are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And when I was doing it, in my early 20s, I certainly didn't have a clue that they would end up having careers that would run 50 years, and they would all be icons. So, jumping back forward, the first series that I did that was digital, and it took me a while to convert to digital, and I did it once I have a good friend who was the head of the photography department at the University of Minnesota, and he was committed to silver-based film and printing. And when he moved to digital, I said, okay, my time to go. So, and this was back in 2005 when I started this series. And I always had interest in, things, outer space, through telescopes, whatever. And so I decided to play a game. I called this one Outer Spaces, and trying to speculate, trying to create some artificial environments that didn't exist, but to build it, to weave together elements that I'd collected. Photographers collect images over time. And so I had a bunch of these things that, don't mean anything now, but given I'm talking about how I did it, I'm going to tell you. These were lichens I collected, water symbols. This came from Mars, from a lander that was coming down. This was an extremophile in Yellowstone Park. Some of the images come from satellites. This was the Namib Desert. That's also an extremophile. So my idea was to have irreverence to scale and to not be limited by the laws of gravity. So that allows you a lot of freedom when you're creating an image. These are all down in the basement of the residence. These 3, I think, are together, and that one's around the corner. But it was, I did my first exhibit of digital work back in that year, and it was a really interesting exercise for me to go through. This one was actually hatched, this series, which was called Entangled Strings, was I really developed when I was here. I didn't do the artwork here, but the concepts that I learned I took with me. And this one is called Higgs Ocean. I don't know what Higgs Ocean is. Still don't know what it is. But based on what I learned, what I read, what I heard, I decided to try to visualize something that might be, add mass to particles. This one was an interesting series because it was all my thought experiments in my mind. I would take all these photographs in this series were just everyday objects. The photographs were, the first photograph was something that you'd never take a second look at. And so what I tried to do is say, okay, if I can abstract and think about what strings might look like, if you took any physical item and reduced it to strings, how different would everyday objects be if you took it one level away from reality? So I found an algorithm. That was the hardest part, and you can't really see it from here, but if you happen to be in the residence, you can go look at these closely, and you'll see that there are tiny little strings down to the smallest size that you can see with the human eye. This is all built with little strings. Well, it turned out the algorithm I discovered was an algorithm from astrophysics. It was an edge detection algorithm. And so once I had that, then I tried to visualize what a final photograph would look like from the funny image that I originally started with. And if the image turned out anywhere close to what my thought experiment was, I kept it. And then the next image had to meet the same test. They were all shot with the same camera, They were all shot in the studio, tabletop, same lens, no cropping, no editing, other than the one pass that I ran through with a detection algorithm. So this one I called Multiverse. And I think there are 6 prints from that series that are on the 3rd floor. This was an interesting challenge that Lars gave me. He said, well, we're going to have a kids' room. And we want to have something in the kids' room that, and so I started thinking about, I had, young grandkids, or young grandkid, I think, at the time. And I thought, okay, well, what images can I create that won't cause them nightmares? And so I used the same basic algorithm that I used. These have some of the string components of it, but then I decided if you look on the floor in there, there are carpet squares. And so I created it in a square format, and the backgrounds match the colors in the floor, or close to it. And then I decided, okay, they can't be hung at the normal height, because these are kids playing on jungle gyms and playing with toys on the floor. So when you're in that room, you'll see that they're all hung down to about this level. But I must say that this was really one of the funnest exhibits, or funnest series, because every time I'm here, I try to wander into the room, and if there are kids there, I'll ask them, which one of these is your favorite, or what do you like about it? And they always will tell you.
Sorry, were those real colors of the bugs?
No, again, a lot of the images, scientific images that I play with start as black and white images. And as you know, most of the ones that come from space start as black and white images in raw format, and you can then take those and adjust them any way you choose to. So I created all of those color combinations myself, thinking I wanted to have a palette that kids would enjoy. And again, I did do some tests, focus group tests with kids to see how they played. This one is, I think, up on the 3rd floor, and it's called Van Gogh's Labyrinth, and it was a series that I called Gray Matter, Dark Matter. And the whole idea, when I was here on the subsequent year, I attended one neuroscience program and one that was on dark matter. And I would, of course, look at the symbols that were used in the projections and then try to figure out, okay, how could some of the things that to me look galactic were actually photographs of neuron structures, and some of the things that I thought were neuron structures were actually outer space dark matter simulations. So, once I take the image and start playing with it, it's no longer a scientific image that any scientist who worked on it would recognize. And if they did, and in many cases I would meet people here, I'd see something that they had produced as a simulation, like we were looking at yesterday, and I'm thinking, oh God, how could I use that? And I get permission to use it. And I know for all of you, when you choose a color because it means something. There's a temperature, there's a time scale, it's something that's meaningful as a visualization. I disregard all of that. I make the colors whatever I want them to be. I will take something that's astrophysical. I was telling Lars there was one element, and not in this picture, but I have a friend who's an astronomer, and he came to that first exhibit, and he saw it, and he said, I know that. I worked on that for 7 years with 6 other people and took 4 satellites to produce that image. And you really did screw with it, didn't you? So I took that as a compliment. But usually when you name, at least my case, when I name pieces, I let the work flow out and get done with it, and then I live with it for a while, and then I'll decide what to name it. And this one, I thought of Starry Night from Van Gogh, and that's what caused me to name it that. This one is also on that floor. Joe Paczynski I got to know very well. As most of you know, he is no longer with us, as my grandkids would say. But it was just a pleasure to know him. I also did video work, so I had the opportunity to bring physicists into the studio and interview them for sometimes half hour at a time. And I have a whole collection of those videos that have been used for various things over the years. But Joe in particular I got to know well, and I never understood Paczynski's paradox, and I noticed in the residence on the floor I'm at, there are 6 or 7 copies of Joe's string theory book, textbook, which I know I could never make it through. But I did, I was very gratified and honored when his family asked me to give both a photograph that I'd taken in that first series I did, but in color of Joe, which is on the cover of his memoir that he wrote that was published after his death. And then I also gave them copies of the videos that I shot, and which they used, I think, in the celebration of life. And they meant a lot to them because it really captured Joe's unique personality. I'll tell you one side story. I don't want to keep us from cookies. But so the first time I interviewed Joe was in a kind of more open environment, and it was kind of pretty well lit, and I think I had a sound person there, someone helping with the lights. And I could tell Joe was a little bit nervous. He didn't know me all that well, didn't know what questions. And so I said, Joe, here's the deal. I'm going to ask you questions. If you don't like the question I asked, answer any question you want to, because my voice is not going to be on the video. So, and I said, the one thing I'd ask you to do is look either at me, I had 2 cameras, look either at me or look at the camera over here. Just one or the other, that's great. He said, yeah, I got it. So I immediately start the cameras. I ask him the first question, and immediately his eyes go right to the floor. And I thought to myself, I have a feeling I know how this man thinks. And it was a trademark, because despite all my coaching, I had to come up with, as I was interviewing him, the comments were just great, the audio was perfect, but I had to figure out how to do visual overcuts so that I didn't have pictures only of Joe looking at the floor after the question. Well, the second and third time I thought I had it nailed, because I had no sound person in the room, no director, no lighting person. Joe was there, I was here, had the camera, and he said, yeah, I got it this time. I'm going to get it in the first question right to the floor. But it's a very fond memory for me. This one some of you might recognize if you happen to receive the KITP 2022 card at the end of the year. An element of this particular image actually was on that card. This year, I was asked to produce another one, and so this was the actual card called Galactic Swarm. This was a series I was doing on kind of these swarms and murmurations, and I realized that there are galactic swarms. I mean, the term gets applied to lots of different fields of science, and so I played with it. This one, and again, the irreverence to scale, this is a pretty good example of that. And it also marks a transition in the kind of equipment I use. In my studio in Minnesota, my grandkids counted last summer and said, Baba, you have over 50 cameras that are lined up all over your studio. And I said, really? I said, I knew I had a lot of them. I didn't. He said, well, actually 54. And I said, I've used most of them. And sometimes people now, when they know I have this collection, they give me their old cameras. But this is the first exhibit piece that I did with my cell phone. And I was really interested in flow. I always have been interested in the whole idea of dynamics of flowing objects, fluid dynamics. And I'm going to tell you the story behind this one. So I'm sitting in the hot tub in Palm Springs where I live. And all of a sudden I saw this image. And you can imagine it's evening, I have no neighbors, you know, no swimsuit. And I figure I got to shoot this picture. It's too interesting for me. So I jump out, all wet, go inside, find my cell phone, which is the same one I still use, Galaxy phone, and I said, I'm going to capture this image. And so I stood up, took the image like this, and it came out exactly the way I wanted it. And it's a big piece. It's about that size. And I had it during COVID. I had it hanging in a studio that I was in San Luis Obispo. And the curator of the San Luis Obispo Museum of Art, called SLOMA, not MoMA or SF MoMA, SLOMA. And she said, "No, I hear you have this piece." And I had it hanging outside. And I said, "Well, I'm not there right now." But she said, if you'd like, she said, "I really want to see it." And I said, "Okay, well, I'll make arrangements for someone to meet you." And so she went to the studio and went up to the 4th floor. And she called me back and said, "I want it." And for this exhibit that was coming out. And I said, "Well, it's all yours. I'm not sure how I'll get it to you, but we'll work that out." COVID had its own challenges. But we got it to the gallery. At that point in time, we were able to go to an opening night with masks. And I walked in, and it was hanging right in the front, upside down. And I thought to myself, and this happened to me before, I thought to myself, there's no way I'm going to tell this young curator that she hung it upside down. Even though she printed it right side up on the cover of the brochure that she was handing out, it was clearly upside down. So it stayed on the wall of the gallery for 2 months, and I never told her. She probably has no idea that I did. And don't tell her. Okay, now I'll move into a series I'm working on right now that it's not complete yet. It's called Excitation. And some of you who are into music might remember Good Vibrations, Excitations, Beach Boys song. That came to mind, but that's not actually what I was thinking of. And it was interesting listening to the talk yesterday. Even though I didn't understand it, I heard light, waveforms, fluids, sound. And that's precisely what I was doing with this one. I set up a whole tabletop environment where I could feed a fixed signal. I found an old speaker that was about that big in the wash. Someone had thrown a big speaker away, and I took it apart, took the parts of it, took the speaker out, and I built a platform with a speaker and then connected it to a frequency generator and an amplifier. Put fluids in a petri dish with glass, different kinds of glass, and the whole idea was not to photograph objects, but to photograph light, sound, and fluid dynamics. And that's the topic, just that itself. So, and this, again, was another experiment where I shot this with a cell phone, I shot it in the studio, I shot it full frame, and it's actually exactly the way I shot it. There's no Photoshop, there's no nothing in it. It's precisely the way I shot it. And this one actually, I remember, was the frequency was 32 hertz. And once I dialed it up to 32 hertz, all of a sudden I had this beautiful waveform in this petri dish with glass and water. And then occasionally I will add other viscosities. I remember this one because it was a drop of olive oil because I wanted something that would float on the top and be a different viscosity. So I probably ruined the mystery of it by telling you that some of these things come from my kitchen or whatever. But that's the way artists work. And if you look, well, let's see, you can't really see it on this one. Maybe not that one either. This one was a similar experiment frequency. I had glass beads that I ordered from Amazon, just broken pieces of glass that you'd put in a jar, or round pieces that look like you find on the beach. And then I used different kinds of lighting. I built this thing enclosed, so it was all black around the outside with a hole in the top. And then I bought a bunch of cheap lasers, LED lights, just things that I could use to excite the waves that I was creating, the waveforms I was creating. And so these forms all came, I remember this particularly, that came from a circular LED light that I'd positioned over the top that had a hole in it, and I shot the photograph through it. This one might be the Christmas card next year, or the holiday card next year. I don't know. But again, these are just very simple round glass beads. Again, the same program. I often will put a gel underneath it or a color underneath it if I'm lighting it from the top. Many of the images you saw earlier were actually lit from underneath, where I didn't have a soundboard, so I had light underneath. But you know, I probably took 15 or 20 images before I got what I wanted on this one. And the colors I injected with a little eyedropper and food coloring. Again, demystifying the whole picture for you. Usually when I'm exhibiting in a gallery or a museum, when people ask me, you know, what does this mean? My answer is, what does it mean to you? I learned over the years, over all the years of doing it, that it's much more beneficial for me to hear what you see rather than what I saw, and then many times I've forgotten. Because when you're in the midst of creation, you all know, if you're coming up with a solution and you're thinking about it, you're in a zone when you do it. And oftentimes you don't know how you got to where you got to until well after the image is, in my case, the image is made and done. I now have a TV that was made by Samsung called the Frame, which is designed for artwork, and it hangs perfectly flat on the wall. It's 1 inch. You can leave an image on it all day long. It never burns. And it has a great finish over it. So when people come to our home, or our homes, when they see images on the wall on this big screen, they think it's a permanent photograph that's hanging there because it looks that realistic. So this one has been up now for probably 3 weeks, and my spouse of many decades is my first test. And if she says, get that out of here, I don't want that in the house, I comply. But this one she liked, and as the other two I've shown. And so, you know, this whole exhibit probably won't come together for another 6 months or a year, and I'll be collecting images and then deciding from that which ones will actually end up. Typically, in an exhibit, a gallery exhibit, you'll end up with something less than 20 images. A lot of it depends on how big your images are, and in recent years I've been making big images, and which work great at the residence because they have these huge open spaces. Some of my big images just get swallowed up in there. I could have gone bigger, but I didn't. So I think, I know cookies are coming up here pretty quick. I don't know if you have any questions, but if you do, I'm happy to answer them now, or cookie break, yes.
Why do you use the cell phone rather than a camera?
The telephone is the camera, and that's the answer. I could get 108 pixels on the Samsung phone, the S21 Plus, whatever they call it. I've compared images with the latest of my 50 cameras, and for instance, on the last several images, the field of view, you can tell, is pretty wide. It's a 16 by, I think that's probably a 16 by 9 view, maybe even more than that. So I get a wide angle that's in focus. There are algorithms in there. I mean, most people, you'll realize this, but most people that take photographs with either modern cameras or phones have no idea how many you want to call it AI, how much AI is built into every image they create. And that's why virtually all of you can be, and probably are, good photographers. And so the challenge for people who call themselves photographers, and those that make a living, which I don't do doing it, I did other things to make a living, but those that do, are having a real struggle, because you want to get a picture of the Niagara Falls. Guess what? There were 1,000 of them taken this morning. And someone is going to be in the right position with the right exposure to shoot the right shot. So you'll see most photographers today are moving toward publication. So they create books. And that's where you see the difference between the one-shot wonder and someone who has a vision for a body of work. Any other questions?
So the last picture you showed, was there a lot of computer processing besides just taking the picture? You changed colors, the last one, or it was all natural?
Yeah, well, and the focus on those particular images, and some of them I may choose to try again, we'll see. I actually felt very comfortable with what they call depth of field and the focus. Most of those were shot handheld at a 30th of a second. And having a little bit of motion in there, I felt was useful because it wasn't static. It indicated that there was movement taking place in the image, and that's what I wanted it to show. Yes?
The one that hang upside down in the gallery, is there no paint in there? Is
No
it
paint
just an
at all.
image?
That one I used a rather simple algorithm, because at that point in time, in that particular flow, I was trying to visualize what flows on planets that had been frozen and that still had liquids, whether the liquids were methane or whatever else on, places like Jupiter or Jupiter's moons. And I'd seen some photographs of that, and that's what it reminded me of. So I thought, well, if that image were frozen methane, what would the surface of that look like? And so I was able to use an algorithm to create that surface that made it look more dimensional. It had more of a look of paint. And in fact, your question is a good one, because many people, when they come to an exhibit, will assume that what they're looking at are paintings, not photographs. And just one comment about all the artwork that you see in the residence. It was all created by a photo lab I use in Berlin, Germany. And we had to figure out how to get multiple copies of certain images from all the artists that contributed. And I think we had licenses for up to 6 for each image. And then I had to figure out how to get them to look like the original piece. And in many cases, the original piece was on paper. It might have been paint on canvas or paint on board. It could have been pencil drawings. And so it was a real challenge for me. And being an artist and trying to pick and match color for another artist is a huge responsibility. And so I took it very seriously. And I knew that given that the lab I was using was thousands of miles away, I couldn't be there standing over it and saying, no, you got to tweak that color. And fortunately, and at least I think you're telling me the truth, that most of the artists that have seen it like what they saw, and they felt that it represented what they had in mind. And if you see them, I find it, even when I was there, and I'm staying there now, and there's one piece in the bedroom that I always liked. The artist in residence who was here for 17 years or so, who just passed away a few years ago. It was one of his pieces, which I really liked. And it was fun to be there and to actually see the finished pieces, because I had to do all of the layouts from the blueprints, not in real time. So someone else had the responsibility for actually hanging them, but I would tell them how high to hang them and where to hang them and how to hang them. And then hopefully when I came back, they were where they were supposed to be and were still on the wall. And out here you have to worry about things like earthquakes. So when you're sleeping quietly in your bed and you've got a big piece that's printed on metal, over you that could come straight down. You know, we had to come up with some ideas on how to keep that on the wall in the case of an earthquake. So you can rest assured that they all have that capability. Maybe one more question, and then we'll break for. Yes.
So you mentioned that you have been in residence not only with physics but other institutions.
Right.
How would you compare your experience?
Oh, there's no comparison, really. I mean, as much as I enjoyed the other experiences, the only one I've come back to for 12 years, 11 or 12 years, is this one. It's always so welcoming, and I still, you know, find it energizing to sit, and even though now that I don't have angst when I sit in an audience where I don't understand really what's going on the board. I really default to, okay, what can I glean from this? And I remember the speaker yesterday, who I don't think happens to be here, but I didn't really understand a word of it. But I try to think, okay, what is he describing when he's describing, you know, mirror image that can't be superimposed? And I thought, well, maybe it has to do with the hand. So I asked Lars after, I said, I'm not sure that I got anything out of this, but is it possible that that word has to do with this? And he said, yes, and maybe he was just being kind. But I can tell you that I've always been fascinated with crystals, and I know some of you are involved in, or maybe all of you are involved in that domain. And clearly one of the series that I want to work on in the future will involve crystals. I oftentimes, in fact, I have created images with crystals where what I often do, when I had my first grandchild, I remember her coming to my studio and spending hours, and Nancy said, well, look, did you have a hassle babysitting? And I said, no, I finally found someone my own age to play with. And really, that's what I do. I play, and so many of the things that I use to create images, I buy in toy stores. I'll buy a magnetic set and break the magnetic set and take out the stuff that's inside of it. And you know, so that's part of the experimental part of the experience. How do kids get fascinated, as I was, and probably all of you were, with whatever scientific toys or experiments or chemistry sets or vector sets or Legos or whatever it was. But all of us that ended up doing the kinds of things that you do and I do have some visual component in there that they need to satisfy. And so, boy, having a grandkid that will play with me for 2 hours, I mean, it's my pleasure. So, in fact, it is my pleasure to get you on to cookies, and I'll be hanging around here, so if you have any more questions, feel free to ask, and thanks for taking the time.